Today we're going to be covering something historians have been arguing about for a very long time. It's a very sad story, and it has parallels with events currently occurring in Eastern Europe today. It's called appeasement. Now, in order to understand the origins of appeasement, you first have to understand Britain in the 1930s. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression. Popular culture was dominated by a pacifist rejection of World War I. Money was tight, the empire was on the wane. But the general feeling was that as long as we tightened our belts, kept our stiff upper lips, and played on, everything would be all right in the end. Then 1933 happened. Yes, the rise of Hitler put the British government in a bit of a bind, because on one hand, diplomats and soldiers stationed in Germany were telling them that the Nazis were bad news for peace in Europe. On the other, many British people, including quite a few politicians, simply couldn't accept that the Nazis both liked war and saw it as a perfectly valid means of restoring Germany's, glory, Germany's sense of place in the sun. And it wasn't because no one told them so either. In 1933, 80,000 people protested in Hyde Park against anti-Semitic discrimination in Germany. In the same year, the British ambassador to Germany, Sir Horace Rumbold, wrote back to Britain warning the government that Hitler had resurrected German militarism and advising that only strength would deter him. In July of 1934, Austrian Nazi terrorists, trained and equipped by Germany, invaded Austria and murdered the Chancellor before themselves being crushed by the Austrian army. Does this sound familiar? Good. Now, despite all of this, the British public remained dead set against rearmament. Things were complicated further when, in 1935, Mussolini took the Italian army to conquer Abyssinia. Now, hoping to keep Italy on side against Germany, Britain and France tried to give Italy part of Abyssinia in something called the Hall-Laval Pact between the British and French Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, respectively. Now, this didn't work because it got leaked to the press and a lot of people were very peed off about it. The British and French public, somewhat confusingly, were not prepared to back rearmament, but they also weren't prepared to let other countries get their way either. You can see why this is a bit of a problem. Now, in March 1936, things got worse when Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland. This was absolutely against the Treaty of Versailles, but neither Britain nor France really did anything about it other than send a few strongly worded, complaints basically to the German government saying, could you please not do this? We have a very strong opinion about this. And if you don't pull your troops out of the Rhineland, we'll send an even more strongly worded letter. Now, the truth is, France wasn't ready for war. It was in the middle of an economic and political crisis, and Britain also couldn't really send troops anyway because it had spent the last 15 years cutting its army back to the absolute bone. On top of this, Stanley Baldwin had also been told that the British Empire wouldn't support him in a war with Germany over the Rhineland because Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they were all in similar straits. Now, on the surface, not acting on the Rhineland made sense, therefore. The problem was the failure to act on the Rhineland over something so fundamental to the Treaty of Versailles basically sent the message to Eastern European countries that Britain and France were not going to hold up their end of the promises of the post-First World War agreement. And what this resulted in was basically all the post-war treaties and agreements that had been made between countries like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, essentially collapsing because all of these countries suddenly realised that France isn't going to back them and they basically have to look out for themselves as best they can. This made Europe more likely in the long term, because it also means Germany can now bully Eastern Europe while keeping its border with France secure. Now, in Britain, Stanley Baldwin is replaced by Neville Chamberlain in May 1937, and Chamberlain is a man on a mission. He wants to prevent war at all costs. He believes this can be done by giving Germany back some of its colonies and allowing it to regain territory in Europe. He also wants to disentangle Britain from foreign affairs and concentrate on reform at home. That's his big thing. Chamberlain was the Lord Mayor of Birmingham, and before he became Prime Minister, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. He is fundamentally a domestic reforms politician. Some historians have claimed that Chamberlain basically wanted to buy Britain more time to rearm, but there's really no evidence of this. Chamberlain had actually watered down military spending proposals in 1934 and later in 1936. These proposals would have involved beefing up the British Army, spending more on modernising the Navy, and basically preparing Britain for a potential modern conflict in Europe. And Chamberlain waters down both the naval aspect and especially the army aspect. He's much more interested in basically giving Britain a domestic fighter protection force. Because remember, again, this is the 1930s. People have this image of mass aerial warfare, of bomber warfare, like we think about the nuclear apocalypse. Completely unrealistic in hindsight, and basically, until the very end of World War II, utterly mistaken. But there we have it. Now, in order to avoid war, Chamberlain begins to press Germany for agreements on peace in Europe, and he manages to secure an Anglo-German naval treaty in 1937 that appears to give hope that the Germans are interested in this. What it basically does is limit the German Navy to a certain size respective to the Royal Navy. The trouble is that this gives Hitler false hope. This also gives Chamberlain false hope. Hitler false hope that Britain is prepared to basically come to an agreement with Germany against Bolshevism, and Chamberlain false hope that Germany can be prepared, persuaded to pursue a peaceful policy in Europe. Now, this quickly runs into problems. In February and March of 1938, Hitler begins to mobilize troops on the Austrian border in order to pressure the German government to agree to Anschluss with Germany. In addition to the Anschluss, in addition to the ideology of absorbing a fellow German nation, there's also very real pragmatic sides to this. The German economy at this point, despite Hitler's rearmament, and partly because of it, is in trouble. It needs gold. It is almost completely out of foreign currency. Austria has lots of gold. It has lots of foreign currency. Now, many Austrians were previously in favour of Anschluss, but that had been before the Nazis had come to power. Remember in 1934, when the Nazis tried to take over Austria, it didn't go particularly well. Now, the Austrian government, concerned and perhaps trying to buttress its support, decided that it needed to hold a plebiscite, a referendum on the issue. Hitler, and this is very telling, takes this basically as a rejection. And he decides that basically this is the carte blanche he needs to send troops into Austria. Britain and France have basically replied to all Austrian requests for a security guarantee with, no, you're on your own, mate. And basically because of that, the Austrian government decides to give up without a fight. Germany broadcasts images of jubilant civilians that persuade the British government and French government that You know, the Germans can do what they like in their own backyard. After all, the Austrians are Germans as well, and completely ignore the fact that thousands of Austrians are arrested and thrown into concentration camps, and the Austrian former defense minister is murdered. Now, all of this was completely against the treaties of 1919. Britain issued a diplomatic protest at the use of force, but Chamberlain otherwise maintained that the Anschluss would not change government policy. The strongest condemnation of the Anschluss came not from European countries, but from Mexico. Now, a few months later, in September 1938, Hitler begins to stir up trouble in the Sudetenland, in Czechoslovakia. Nazi terrorists attack Jewish businesses, kill Czechoslovakian policemen, and try to take over council buildings in the Sudetenland. The Czechoslovakian army mobilizes. Now, France had a treaty with Czechoslovakia guaranteeing Czechoslovak territory and independence. This is important. Basically, France legally has to protect Czechoslovakia. But desperate to avoid war, Chamberlain travels to Munich to negotiate. He does not invite the Czechoslovakian government. Now, during this whole crisis, Chamberlain's actions are quite fishy, basically. He sends one of his personal favourites, a Mr. Henderson, over as the German ambassador, and Henderson is basically an uncritical Germanophile. He says all sorts of things about the way Germans are being treated in the Sudetenland that are completely untrue. He basically poo-poos the Czechoslovakian government completely. He does all kinds of really very unprofessional, very undiplomatic things in order to tell Chamberlain basically what Chamberlain wants to hear. Now, the deal that Chamberlain thrashes out at Munich becomes known to history as the Munich Agreement. Germany gets the Sudetenland, along with basically all of the Czech industry that is in it. Now, this is a huge problem for Czechoslovakia because the Sudetenland is mostly mountainous territory. It is basically Czechoslovakia's natural border. The Czechoslovakians have spent the last decade or so building fortifications in these mountainous areas. It's also where most of the Czech industry is located, where most of the Czechs' national resources are located. In exchange for all of this, Hitler gives a written promise that he will not violate the rest of Czechoslovakian territory. The Czechoslovak government was sent the deal and were told that if they refused to accept it, they were on their own. The Czechoslovakians, basically abandoned and betrayed, collapsed. When Chamberlain returned to Britain, he was greeted as a hero as he stepped out of the aircraft. He said, "My good friends, for the second time in our history, a British Prime Minister has returned from Germany bringing peace with honour. I believe it is a peace for our time. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts. Go home and get a nice quiet sleep." In March of 1939, just a few months later, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Only then did Chamberlain accept that Hitler was not interested in a peaceful Europe. Again, there have been lots of people trying to claim, there was a film recently that did this, trying to claim that Chamberlain was somehow trying to buy peace for Britain to rearm. His diaries don't support this. Everything that we know about how Chamberlain reacted to the German reoccupation, basically of the Rhineland, of Austria, of the Sudetenland, and then the occupation of Czechoslovakia, basically shows he genuinely believed for a very long time that Germany was simply reclaiming its lost territory, and that once all the German-speaking territories had been reunited, Hitler would be satisfied. March 1939 was a real body blow to Chamberlain's morale. He became much more pessimistic after this, basically. And it's really a sign of just how badly shaken the government is by this and how unprepared it is that in that same month the government reintroduces conscription in peacetime, the first time, I believe, in British history. And it does this basically without at all consulting the army, which had its own expansion plans. And the result of this is that when war comes in September 1939, the British Army goes into the field basically glutted with lots of inexperienced recruits, and they're led by generals who lack training in handling large formations. Historians have been divided on appeasement ever since. During World War II, Chamberlain was crucified for what was seen by many as having enabled German aggression. From the 1960s onwards, Chamberlain's defenders, such as A.G.P. Taylor, argued that the year he bought was vital for Britain to rearm. Now, against this, we have to look at the economic and military realities of September 1938. In 1938, the German armed forces were still very much a work in progress. During the occupation of Austria, General Heinz Guderian reported that more than half of the vehicles in his units broke down on the way to their objectives. The units tasked with seizing Vienna took a week to get there in a journey that should have taken, at most, 2 days. Had the Austrian army been ordered to put up even token resistance, which they were prepared to do, the German army would probably have been humiliated. However, Germany was able to avoid this because its bluff was never called. By absorbing first Austria and then Czechoslovakia, Germany was able to basically keep its economy going far longer than it should have done. It was able to use effectively Austrian and Czech money and gold reserves to fuel what had up until then been an economy that was basically running on fumes and hope. It was also able to secure its flanks in southern Europe, basically, and Central Europe, and it was able to use the territory it had captured to threaten and bully other countries in Eastern Europe, such as Yugoslavia, such as Hungary, such as Poland, such as Romania. There's also the military aspects. Appeasement allowed the German army to use the occupations of Austria and Czechoslovakia as basically massive, hyper-realistic exercises. Basically, German army units, although they did very little, if any, actual fighting, were able to see how things worked when they actually went into the field. They were able to see which officers were incompetent. They were able to see what organization systems worked. They were able to sort out many of the teething problems that they would have otherwise had war broken out in 1938. They were also able to absorb all the equipment of the Czech and Austrian armies. This made training the army and expanding the army much, much simpler. About a quarter of the tanks Germany used in the conquest of France in 1940 were made in Czechoslovakian factories. Even then, however, the Wehrmacht was far from invincible. In 2 weeks of fighting in Poland, it used up pretty much all the ammunition it had stockpiled since 1934. Many German soldiers basically sent to the front in the early stages of World War II had just 6 weeks of training. Basically, they were powered forward by nothing much more than belief in the might of the German Wehrmacht. Britain and France, on the other hand, if you look at what they achieved in the time bought, it's negligible. The Royal Air Force did have the chance to expand its fighter force, but the Battle of Britain wouldn't have happened without the fall of France. And the fall of France in turn happened because the French armed forces failed to take the opportunity to modernise their mobilisation system, failed to take the opportunity to separate domestic politics from military strategy, and failed to adopt a sensible operational plan. And as for Britain, basically the British government completely failed to use the year bought in 1938 to properly expand the British Army, to basically come up with a sensible system for training staff officers, for training senior commanders in how to use large formations, and failed to build an air force that could provide competent tactical support to army units on the battlefield. All of this meant that when war came in 1939 and 1940, the British Army and the Royal Air Force, the two forces that were really going to influence the outcome of the war on the battlefield, were simply too small, too poorly trained, and simply not ready to influence the outcome in any meaningful way. This in turn resulted in Britain in 1940 being left in a very, very dangerous position when France fell. Appeasement was a product of its times. It was put forward by politicians who misunderstood the balance of military power and embraced a British public that was gripped by the mud and blood pacifism of World War I. But maybe I've been a bit harsh on Chamberlain. Perhaps we have to remember that we elect the politicians we deserve. You can find excellent reading subject in the description, so please let us know in the comments below, and please subscribe for more easy history.